I never thought a strip of gravel cutting through my land would turn into a legal war, but in Red Hollow Estates, it only took one laminated notice zip tied to my fence to flip everything upside down. The Willow Creek HOA decided, without asking me once, that my private service road was now a community access corridor, like they could just rename reality with a stamp and a smile. I found it on a Thursday afternoon, swinging in the wind like it belonged there. Dark blue seal, no signature, no court order, just authority pretending to exist. My name is Ethan Carter, and I bought this land back in 2009 when it was still quiet enough to hear the wind moving through the oaks instead of golf carts, and pool traffic bleeding through the trees. My property sits at the very edge of the subdivision, where manicured lawns slowly give way to gravel, pine needles, and a long private road I built and maintained myself, a road that was never meant to carry anyone but me, maybe a contractor once in a while, never a parade of strangers cutting through like it was public infrastructure. But the HOA saw something different. They saw convenience. They saw a shortcut between their recreation center and the main gate, and apparently that was enough for them to decide ownership was optional. I still remember standing there reading that notice, feeling this strange mix of disbelief and irritation, because it was so casual, so bureaucratically confident, like I was the one misunderstanding the world. The document referenced some supposed provision from 2004, claiming implied access rights, but there was nothing attached, no recorded easement, no county filing, nothing that actually held legal weight, just language designed to sound official enough that most people would comply without questioning it. For a moment, I just laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, like someone trying to declare my kitchen a public restaurant, because they liked walking through it. The next morning, I pulled every record I had, deed history, county plats, survey maps, everything stacked on my dining table while coffee went cold beside me. And the conclusion was painfully simple. There was no easement, no shared access agreement, nothing even remotely close, just my land and their assumption. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, because once you see it that clearly, you stop debating and start deciding. The road they were using connected directly to their recreation center, tennis courts, and overflow parking lot, and I could see it every day from my porch. Cars moving through like I was invisible, tires throwing dust across property I paid taxes on, maintained, and insured, while nobody ever thought to slow down or acknowledge they were crossing a boundary. On one side of that road was their world, chlorinated pools, asphalt heat, and manicured symmetry, and on my side was oak trees, gravel dust, and the slow rhythm of rural land that does not care about subdivision maps. I didn't want conflict, I really didn't, but I also didn't buy land just to watch it get repurposed by committee decision. So I started asking myself a simple question, not whether I was right, because that part was already clear, but what I was going to do about it. I considered ignoring it, letting it slide, maybe even confronting the board with paperwork and hoping common sense would win. But I had lived long enough to know that institutions don't respond to hope. They respond to boundaries that cost them something. So I made a decision that, looking back, was probably the point of no return. I was going to treat this like what it was, not a misunderstanding, but a trespass wrapped in paperwork. I called a contractor the next morning, someone local who understood rural land better than HOA politics, and I ordered a heavy steel swing gate, industrial grade, powder-coated black, the kind you don't install unless you mean it. While the order was being processed, I kept thinking about how strange it was that people can look at a private road and convince themselves it belongs to them, just because they use it often enough, like repetition creates ownership. By the time the contractor confirmed installation schedule, I had already stopped imagining compromise, because compromise only works when both sides recognize the same reality, and Willow Creek HOA had already decided theirs was flexible. I remember sitting on my porch that evening, watching the sun drop behind the treeline, thinking about how quickly a quiet piece of land could become the center of something bigger than it ever asked for, and I knew the next step would change everything, not just for them, but for me too, because once you close a road like that, there's no pretending you didn't mean it. And that was the moment I stopped waiting and started acting. I gave the contractor the final confirmation and told him to install the gate as soon as possible, because if they wanted a corridor, they were going to learn exactly what it cost to walk through mine. The gate went up faster than I expected, but what I didn't expect even more was how something so simple could instantly change the entire atmosphere of a place I had lived with in silence for years. 2 days of construction, steel posts going into the ground like they were marking a decision rather than just holding up a barrier, concrete poured thick and heavy, the kind that doesn't apologize or negotiate. And I remember standing there with Mason, the contractor, watching it all come together in that slow, methodical way that construction always has, where nothing looks impressive until suddenly it does. He didn't say much, just worked, checked levels, tightened bolts, stepped back, adjusted again, and at some point he nodded like it was finished in his head long before it was finished in reality. When the swing gate finally aligned and the lock engaged for the first time, there was this sound, a clean metallic click that echoed off the trees, and I swear the land itself felt different after that moment, like a sentence had been punctuated and there was no more room for interpretation. I didn't install it to provoke anyone, at least that's what I told myself in the beginning, but I also wasn't naive enough to think it wouldn't provoke anything, because people don't like discovering that convenience has limits, especially when they've never had to think about where that convenience comes from. The first morning after installation, I stayed inside longer than usual, just watching for the kitchen window, coffee in hand, going cold again without me noticing, because I wanted to see the reaction without being part of it. It didn't take long. A car came down the subdivision road like it always did, turned toward the recreation center like it always did, then slowed, stopped, reversed slightly, paused again like the driver was waiting for the world to correct itself, and then finally turn around. That moment repeated itself over and over that morning in different variations, different cars, different drivers, but the same confusion, the same hesitation, like they were encountering a rule that had always been invisible and suddenly became real. By mid-morning, I could already see the effect on the HOA side. Fewer cars at the recreation center parking lot, more traffic at the main entrance, and I remember thinking how strange it is that something can function for years on assumption alone until one day someone simply refuses to participate in the assumption anymore. Around noon, the phone started ringing, and I didn't even have to look at the screen to know what it was. The first call I answered was Linda March, the HOA board chair, and her voice came in sharp but controlled, the kind of controlled that only exists right before it breaks. She didn't ask questions, she didn't ease into it. She went straight into accusation, saying I had obstructed a community access route, that I had created a safety issue, that I needed to remove the gate immediately or face formal escalation. And I remember leaning against the counter listening to her, looking out at the very road she was talking about, feeling something oddly calm, because for the first time the situation wasn't theoretical anymore. It was fully real, fully defined, fully mine in a way it had never been before. When she paused to breathe, I finally spoke, not raised, not aggressive, just steady, and I told her she should check her email. There was a silence on the line after that. Not empty, but heavy, the kind of silence where you can almost hear someone opening a laptop in another room. What I had sent wasn't emotional. It wasn't a rant. It was structured like something that had already been reviewed by someone who expected resistance. A private road use agreement, clearly written. Clean language. Monthly access fee set at $280. 30-day payment terms. Liability insurance requirement naming me as additional insured, and a clause that allowed me to suspend or revoke access codes at my discretion if terms were violated or unpaid. No drama in the document, just structure, and structure has a way of sounding unreasonable only to people who benefited from the absence of it. When she called back the second time, her tone had changed. Less control now, more direct, almost offended, saying I couldn't possibly charge an HOA for access to what they considered a community corridor. That word again, considered, like belief, was enough to reshape ownership. I told her calmly that I wasn't charging them for anything. I was offering them terms to continue using my private property, and that if they didn't agree, they were free to stop using it immediately. There was another long pause, and I could hear papers moving on her end. Maybe you're sitting down, maybe someone else in the room, I don't know, but I could feel the shift happening in real time, that slow realization that the situation wasn't going to be argued away. By late afternoon, the tone of communication changed completely. Greg Halden from the board called next, trying a different angle, softer, almost diplomatic, saying they had used the road in good faith for years, that this would create unnecessary tension in the community, that surely there must be a compromise somewhere in the middle. I remember actually letting out a small laugh at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because compromise is always the first word people use when they realize the thing they took for granted has conditions attached. I told them there was already a compromise. They just hadn't noticed it before because the compromise was that I didn't stop them sooner. That one line went quiet on his end too. Over the next 48 hours, the energy shifted from anger to negotiation in a very specific way that I've come to recognize in people when they realize they can't simply override something anymore. Emails started coming in from different residents, some angry, some confused, a few almost polite, asking for exemptions, discounts, clarification, like they were trying to turn a boundary into a pricing menu they could navigate. One message even asked if occasional users could be billed differently than regular users, and I remember just staring at it for a moment, because it revealed everything about how people process access when it stops being invisible. 2 days later, Linda called again, but this time her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was tired, and she said the board was reviewing the agreement formally, which in HOA language usually means they've realized ignoring it isn't going to make it disappear. I didn't rush her. I didn't push. I just let the silence do its work because at that point I already understood something important. The road wasn't just mine physically, it was mine structurally, and they needed it more than I needed their approval to enforce that reality. When the first payment finally arrived, there was no ceremony, no apology, no acknowledgement of defeat, just a transaction sitting quietly in an account like it had always belonged there. And I remember staring at it thinking how fast principles become invoices when inconvenience becomes routine. That night, I walked out to the gate again, listening to the wind moving through the oak trees, watching headlights turn around in the distance instead of cutting through. And for the first time since this started, I didn't feel like I was reacting to something anymore. I felt like the shape of the situation had already changed permanently, and everything after that would simply have to adapt around it, whether they liked it or not. After the first payment came through, things didn't explode the way people expect in stories like this. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no big legal showdown, just a slow settling of reality, like dust finally dropping after something heavy has already hit the ground. The gate stayed, the code system stayed, and what surprised me most wasn't resistance anymore, but adaptation, because humans adapt faster than they admit, especially when convenience is involved. Within a few weeks, the entire rhythm of the subdivision shifted, traffic patterns changed, residents adjusted their routines, and the recreation center parking lots simply learned to operate with fewer assumptions. I started treating the road less like a battlefield and more like infrastructure I happened to control, checking the lockbox occasionally, updating access codes on a schedule, handling everything with the same boring consistency you'd use for any system that needs to remain functional. What used to feel like conflict slowly turned into maintenance, and that shift alone changed how I carried it in my head, because constant tension burns you out, but structure just exists whether you feel like arguing with it or not. I still remember one afternoon a few weeks later when Mason, the contractor, stopped by again to check on a minor adjustment in the gate hinge, and we stood there talking while he worked, watching cars hesitate, turn, or enter codes without thinking anymore. He laughed at one point and said, "You know, people get used to anything if you give them enough time, even paying for what they used to assume was free," and I didn't really have a counterargument, because he was right in a way that felt uncomfortable. There was one moment that stayed with me longer than the rest, about a month into the new arrangement, when Linda March actually showed up in person instead of calling. I saw her car slow at the entrance, then stop completely, engine off, like she was deciding whether to cross a line that wasn't physical but psychological. Eventually, she got out and walked up to the gate alone, no board members, no documents in hand, just her and the reality of what had changed. Up close, she didn't look angry anymore. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with responsibility that had gotten heavier than expected. She told me the board had underestimated how dependent the community was on the route, that rerouting traffic had created unexpected costs, confusion, even issues with emergency response timing, and she said it without the earlier edge, more like someone reporting a situation than fighting one. Then she paused, and looked at the keypad like it was something unfamiliar now, and asked quietly if I would ever consider removing the fee structure. I remember leaning slightly on the gate post, not blocking her, not inviting her in, just standing in that neutral space where ownership doesn't need to be performed, and I told her honestly that the fee wasn't the problem, the assumption was. That somewhere along the way, a private road had turned into invisible infrastructure in their minds, something they believed existed outside ownership, simply because it was convenient to treat it that way. She didn't argue, not really. She just stood there for a long moment, looking past me into the trees like she was seeing the land for what it actually was instead of what it had been used for. In the end, nothing got undone. The agreement stayed in place, the liability clause stayed, the access system stayed, and life settled into a new normal that nobody liked arguing about anymore, because arguing doesn't change physical systems that are already working. There are still complaints here and there. Of course there were. That never really stops. But complaints are different from action, and over time, even complaints lose their urgency when nothing follows them. A few weeks later, I received the fully executed 3-year agreement, signed, dated, clean, no drama attached, and I remember sitting at my table longer than I expected just looking at it, realizing how anticlimactic real resolution often is compared to how loud the conflict feels at the beginning. The most surprising part of the entire experience wasn't the confrontation or the gate or even the money. It was how quickly people normalized what they initially called impossible, because once a boundary proves it can hold, people stop debating whether it should exist and start organizing their behavior around it. That evening, I walked the gravel road alone, past the oak trees dropping acorns like they always had, listening to the quiet rhythm of a place that hadn't changed as much as people thought it had. And I realized something simple that stayed with me. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had just stopped allowing them to treat it like it wasn't mine. And in a strange way, that felt less like winning and more like finally correcting something that had been out of alignment for years. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Or would you have drawn the line the same way? Because I still think about that part sometimes, more than I expected to. And if you want another story like this, there's one more that starts with a water line they thought was theirs to tap into without asking, and that one didn't end nearly as quietly as this did.